Let me tell you something about the smokehouse. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't fancy, but Lord, it was everything. It was the closest thing we had to a vault, a pantry, and a pharmacy all rolled into one. Because in the old days, the smokehouse was what stood between your family and hunger. You could lose a mule, you could lose a roof, but if you lost the meat in your smokehouse, you'd start praying in new ways by morning. The silent heart of the homestead. If you thumb through the early ledgers of Ashley County, the court books, the agricultural rolls, even the railroad schedules, you'll find all sorts of numbers and names, but you won't find much about the smokehouse. Nobody ever wrote it down because it was as common as a well or a chimney. Every family had one. Every field hand worked from one. Every hog feared one. The census of 1850 lists more than 9,000 hogs in Ashley County. 9,000, and barely 400 horses. That right there tells the story. You didn't ride to town on a hog, but you sure as sin ate from one. Those hogs were the walking currency of the piney woods. They rooted your garden, they cleaned your scraps, and when the frost came on, they became the reason your children made it through to spring. But meat, fresh off the bone, won't keep in a Delta summer. You gotta fix it so it'll hold, so it'll wait for you. That's where the smokehouse came in. Of logs, mud, and necessity. The first smokehouses weren't built for looks. They were built the same way people built their homes, out of logs and mud. Folks called it daubing when they smeared the cracks with a mixture of clay and straw to keep the cold out and the smoke in. That clay turned those log walls into a kind of living lung, breathing just enough to dry the meat, but tight enough to hold the smoke. Some of the old WPA slave narratives from this part of Arkansas mention those early buildings plain as day. Our smokehouse was logs daubed with mud and straw. That little line says it all. It was humble, sure, but it worked. Later, when sawmills came to Hamburg and the courthouse was built from brick burned right out of local clay, the well-off folks upgraded their smokehouses too. They built them from sawn pine or even from fired brick. But whether it was a plantation yard or a sharecropper's clearing, the function was always the same. A dark, steady chamber with a dirt floor and a rafter overhead where the year's labor hung in rows like trophies of survival. The science of salt and smoke. The old folks didn't have thermometers or recipes, they had rhythm. November meant butchering. The first frost was your signal that the flies were gone and the fire could burn slow without spoiling the fat. The hams and shoulders were packed down in boxes of salt, the bellies rubbed with pepper and sugar, and every bit of it turned daily till the salt had drawn the water out. That was the curing. It was science before science knew its own name. Salt preserved what the heat couldn't, and smoke finished what salt began. The fires were built from post oak and hickory, slow and clean, with just enough cypress tossed in to give it a bite, as the old-timer said. That little twist, the cypress from the slough, was Ashley County's signature. It made the meat smell faintly like the woods themselves, the kind of smell that told you, come January, that you were going to make it through another winter. The smokehouse wasn't just for hams either. Folks smoked sausage, bacon, venison, fish, and even cheese if they had milk enough to spare. Every cut was tagged in the mind. That's the sow from May. That's the fat one from Mr. Tuggle's pen. Each slab of bacon was a ledger of a year's labor. Now, most people these days don't have to cure their meat. They just buy it shrink-wrapped and forget the labor it took to earn it. But there's a movement coming back. Homesteaders, gardeners, back to the landers, folks trying to remember what it means to make something last. If you build yourself a smokehouse today, you're not just building a shed, you're reviving an old philosophy. You're admitting that the world still turns by the same rules as it did in 1850. Heat, air, salt, and patience. But I'll tell you straight, if you're going to do it, you best do it right. You can't cure meat with wishful thinking. The old-timers got lucky because they knew their salt, their weather, and their hogs. We don't. So learn the science. Prog Powder 1, that's the modern cure, a mixture of salt and nitrite. It keeps botulism from finding a home in your hams. You don't guess with that, you measure. That's what separates a craftsman from a gambler. Build it sturdy, too. You can still raise one from pine boards like the old-timers, but cinder block will outlast you if you do it right. Give it a small firebox offset to one side, a vent at the bottom for the draw, and a chimney at the top to carry the smoke. Let that smoke move like a river, slow, cool, and even. If you want to smoke hot, barbecue style, keep the chamber around 225 degrees and cook your meat through. But if you want to do it the old way, for preservation, keep it under 100 degrees. Let it whisper, not roar. That's the difference between cooking and curing. The woods still speak. Here in Ashley County, the woods are still full of the same hickory and oak that fed those fires 100 years ago. You can smell them when you drive the county roads at night. The old timber lots, the sawdust mills, the ghost of the smokehouse itself. I once knew a man who said the smell of hickory smoke on a cold morning was better than money. He wasn't wrong, because that smell meant the work was done, the meat was safe, and the family would eat. Conclusion: the architecture of enough. When you think about it, the smokehouse was a miracle of common sense. A piece of architecture built for survival, not style. It stood outside every house farm like a quiet guardian, unglamorous but dependable. Inside, the very air was changed by fire and time. The old hands knew what modern folks are just now relearning, that sustainability isn't a trend, it's a rhythm, a way of living that keeps the world from spoiling before its time. So if you ever get the urge to build one of your own, remember what you're really building. Not a shack, not a hobby, but a promise. A promise that the knowledge of your forebears, their patience, their craft, their stubborn insistence on doing things the hard way still matters, because somewhere between the salt box and the smoke curl lies the truth of Ashley County itself, the art of making something last.